The sun was a hammer on an anvil of baked earth. It beat down from a sky so vast and bleached of color it hurt the eyes to look at it for more than a moment. The land itself, a sprawling canvas of ochre and burnt sienna, held its breath under the onslaught, the heat rising in shimmering waves that distorted the horizon into a drunken line. Cracks, like a web of fine black veins, spread across the ground, thirsting for a rain that hadn't come in months and showed no promise of ever coming again. This was Jack's world. His ranch was a lonely island in this sea of dust and silence, a small, sturdy cabin he'd built with his own hands, a barn that leaned slightly as if tired of the wind's constant bullying, and a corral whose fences were always in need of mending. Dust was a constant companion. It coated the porch railings in a fine powder, settled on the inside of the window panes, and arose in ghostly plumes with every footstep. It was the grit in his coffee, the taste in his mouth when he woke, the shroud that covered everything he owned. Jack was a man shaped by this land, tall and broad-shouldered, with a stillness about him that could be mistaken for laziness by those who didn't know the economy of movement required to survive out here. He was 34, but the lines etched around his eyes and the sun-leathered skin on his hands and neck made him look older. His words were as sparse as the vegetation. He hadn't always been this way. There was a time when the cabin had echoed with laughter, with the soft humming of his wife, Mary, as she worked by the hearth. But the fever had taken her 3 years ago, swift and merciless, leaving a silence in its wake that was louder than any storm. Since then, Jack had simply existed. He worked from sunup to sundown, tending his small herd of cattle, fixing what was broken, and falling into his bed each night with an exhaustion so profound it left no room for dreams. Loneliness was a physical ache, a hollow space in his chest that the wind seemed to find and whistle through on cold nights. He was tired of the silence, tired of his own cooking, tired of the mending that piled up, a constant reminder of the gentle hands that were no longer there. It was this weariness, more than any desire for companionship, that led him to the dog-eared copy of the Matrimonial Gazette. He'd found it in town, left behind on a barrel outside the general store. He read the advertisements from women seeking husbands, teachers from the East, farm girls from the Midwest, widows looking for a new start. Their words were full of hope and propriety, painting pictures of domestic bliss. Jack felt no stirrings of romance. He saw only a practical solution to a practical problem. He needed a wife the way he needed a good horse or a sturdy plow, someone to manage the house, to cook the meals, to bring a semblance of order back to his life. Love had been buried with Mary. What he sought now was a partner in survival. His letter was short and to the point, devoid of any poetry. He described his ranch, his financial standing, modest but stable, and his requirements. He was an honest man, he wrote, and would be a fair husband. He needed a woman who was not afraid of hard work and solitude. He enclosed the requested photograph, a stiff, formal portrait in which he stared grimly at the camera, his discomfort plain to see. He sealed the envelope and sent it off with a man heading east on the supply wagon, then promptly tried to put it out of his mind. It was a transaction, a piece of business. Nothing more. Weeks turned into a month, then another. The sun continued its relentless assault. One afternoon, the sky began to change. The pale blue bled into a sickly yellow-brown at the edges. The wind, which had been a low moan all day, picked up, beginning to howl like a hungry animal. Jack saw it coming from the west, a solid wall of roiling dust, a brown tide that would swallow the world. A dust storm. He'd seen them before, but this one looked angrier than most. He moved with practiced speed, securing the shutters on the cabin, checking the latches on the barn, and driving his few horses into the relative safety of their stalls. The air grew thick, tasting of dirt. The sun vanished, and the world was plunged into a suffocating, ochre twilight. He was just about to bolt the cabin door when he heard it, a faint sound, nearly lost in the shrieking wind. A cry. He hesitated. It was madness to go out in this. Visibility was down to a few feet. He could get lost, wander in circles until he collapsed. But the sound came again, weaker this time, but unmistakably human, cursing under his breath. He pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth, tugged his hat down low, and stepped out into the maelstrom. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stinging his eyes with sand. He leaned into it, squinting, trying to pinpoint the direction of the sound. He stumbled forward, one hand held out in front of him, feeling his way through the blinding chaos. He called out, his voice snatched away and shredded by the wind. Then he saw it, a dark shape on the ground, a crumpled heap of rags that had no place in the middle of his land. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a person, a woman. She was lying on her side, half curled into a ball, her dress torn and filthy. He knelt, his own body a meager shield against the storm. He touched her shoulder, and she flinched violently, letting out a small, terrified whimper. "Ma'am," he yelled over the wind. "Ma'am, you need to get inside." She didn't respond, only trembled. He could see she was hurt. There was a dark stain spreading on the sleeve of her dress, and her face was streaked with dirt and what looked like dried blood. There was no time for questions. With a grunt, he carefully scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, frail as a bird. She gave another frightened cry, but seemed to have no strength left to fight him. He turned his back to the wind and began the slow, arduous journey back to the cabin, his boots sinking into the shifting dust with every step. Inside, the relative quiet was deafening. He bolted the door, shutting out the storm's fury. In the dim light filtering through the dusty windows, he got his first real look at her. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with a tangle of dark hair caked with mud. Her face was pale beneath the grime, her lips cracked and tinged with blue. She was unconscious now, her head lolling against his shoulder. He carried her to his own bed, the first person to lie in it since Mary, and gently set her down. For a moment, he simply stood there, a giant of a man feeling utterly lost in his own home. He was used to dealing with sick cattle, not injured women, but he knew he had to do something. He lit a lantern, the warm glow pushing back the shadows. He fetched water from the basin and tore strips from a clean sheet. He worked with a clumsy tenderness, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he cleaned the gash on her arm. It was deep but clean, a cut from a knife by the look of it. There were other injuries, bruises coloring the skin of her cheek and neck, scrapes on her hands. As he worked, she began to murmur in a delirium, her words disjointed and fearful, names he didn't know, pleas for mercy. Jack gritted his teeth. Whoever she was running from something terrible. He cleaned and bandaged her wounds as best he could, then covered her with a thick quilt. He pulled a chair over to the bedside and sat down, his rifle across his lap, and prepared to wait out the storm. He had intended to take her to Harmony Creek, the nearest town, as soon as the weather cleared. It was a day's ride, but it was the proper thing to do. The storm raged for 2 days. When it finally subsided, it left a world remade in dust. Drifts of fine soil were piled up against the cabin and barn, and a thick brown film covered everything. The woman, he still didn't know her name, remained in a feverish state. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to sip the broth he spooned between her lips, other times lost in a nightmare landscape from which she would cry out in terror. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. She woke with clear, frightened eyes and stared at him. Where am I?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "You're safe," Jack said, his voice gruff. "I found you in the storm. My name is Jack Coulter." She visibly relaxed at the sound of his voice, but the fear didn't leave her eyes. "Clara," she said. "My name is Clara." Her recovery was slow. The cut on her arm was healing, but a deeper wound seemed to fester within her. She was jumpy, flinching at loud noises or sudden movements. For the first week, she barely left the bed. Jack cooked for her, changed her bandages, and kept a respectful distance. They existed in a space of almost complete silence, their world confined to the four walls of the small log cabin. The silence was different now. It was no longer the empty, hollow silence of his grief. It was a living thing, heavy with unspoken questions and shared solitude. He would sit at the small table, cleaning his gun or mending a piece of tack, and he would be acutely aware of her every breath from the bed in the corner. He learned the rhythm of her sleeping, the small sounds she made. As she grew stronger, Clara insisted on helping. At first, it was small things, folding the cloths he used for bandages, stirring the stew on the stove. Soon, she was up and about, moving with a quiet efficiency that surprised him. She cleaned the cabin until it shone, mended his torn shirts with neat, almost invisible stitches, and started baking bread that filled the small space with a warm, forgotten aroma. She worked relentlessly, from the moment she rose until she collapsed into bed, as if trying to physically work the fear out of her body, or perhaps to repay a debt she felt she owed him. Jack found her presence unsettling. The cabin, which had been his solitary fortress for 3 years, suddenly felt crowded. Her scent, a faint mix of soap, wood smoke, and something uniquely female, clung to the air. A hairpin left on the mantelpiece, a shawl draped over the back of a chair. These small signs of her existence were like shouts in the quiet landscape of his life. He kept his distance, treating her with a formal courtesy, but he couldn't stop watching her. He watched her hands, surprisingly strong and capable, as she kneaded dough. He watched the way the firelight caught the red highlights in her dark hair as she sat staring into the flames in the evening. He watched the guarded, haunted look in her eyes, and wondered what terrors she had seen. One evening, he came in from the barn as dusk was settling, painting the sky in shades of violet and rose. The air was cooling, and the scent of rain was on the wind for the first time in an eternity. He stopped in the doorway, unseen. Clara was standing by the open window, looking out at the horizon. She had been washing clothes, and her sleeves were rolled up past her elbows, revealing sun-browned arms. A fine sheen of perspiration glistened on her skin, on her temples, and on the delicate curve of her neck where a few stray tendrils of hair had escaped her bun. In that soft, forgiving light, she wasn't a victim or a patient or an obligation. She was a woman. And as Jack stood there watching her, he felt something stirred deep inside him. A slow, painful thawing in a place he thought had frozen solid 3 years ago. It was a forgotten ache, a warmth that spread through his chest, unfamiliar and unnerving. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of want, not just for a woman's body, but for the life and warmth she represented. He turned away abruptly, his heart pounding, and retreated to the barn, ashamed of a feeling that felt like a betrayal to Mary and a violation of his duty to this vulnerable stranger under his roof. The tension in the cabin grew thick enough to cut with a knife. They moved around each other like cautious animals, their every glance and gesture charged with an unspoken awareness. The small space seemed to shrink, forcing a proximity that was both a comfort and a torment. The breaking point came late one night. Jack was woken from a light sleep by a sound that chilled his blood, a scream. It was raw and ragged with pure terror. He was out of his cot and across the room in 2 strides. Clara was sitting bolt upright in his bed, her eyes wide and unseeing, her hands clenched in the quilt. She was trapped in a nightmare, reliving a horror he couldn't imagine. "No, please don't," she cried, her voice a choked sob. She began to thrash, fighting an invisible enemy. "Clara," Jack said, his voice firm but low. "Clara, wake up, you're safe." He reached out and grabbed her shoulders, trying to still her struggles. The moment his hands touched her, she gasped, her body going rigid, her wide, terrified eyes focused on his face. but he wasn't sure if she was truly seeing him. "It's all right," he said, his voice softer now. "You're here. You're safe with me." He didn't know what else to do. Instinct took over. He pulled her against his chest, wrapping his arms around her trembling body, holding her tight as one might hold a frightened child. He could feel the frantic hammering of her heart against his ribs. He rested his cheek against the top of her head, murmuring quiet, meaningless words of comfort. Slowly, the violent trembling began to subside. Her ragged breaths evened out. She was no longer fighting him. Instead, she sagged against him, a deep, shuddering sob racking her body. He held her, feeling the warmth of her tears soaking through his shirt, and the profound, aching loneliness of his own life seemed to rise up and meet her pain. They were two broken, solitary souls, clinging to each other in the dark. He didn't know how long they stayed like that. Time seemed to stop. When her sobs finally quieted, she stirred, pulling back just enough to look up at him. The lantern he'd left burning low cast long shadows across the room, catching the glint of tears on her lashes. Her eyes were dark pools of pain and exhaustion. Her lips, slightly parted, trembled. Neither of them planned it. Neither of them thought about it. It was a moment born of instinct, of shared misery and a desperate, human need for connection. He lowered his head, and she tilted hers up. Their lips met in a kiss that was not gentle or passionate, but something far more raw. It was clumsy, hesitant, and trembling with the weight of all their unspoken grief. It tasted of salt and sorrow. It was a drowning man's gasp for air, a moment of pure, unthinking instinct in the vast, silent wilderness of their lives. And when it ended, just as suddenly as it began, they pulled apart, breathing hard, the silence rushing back in to find them both shocked, ashamed, and irrevocably changed. The dawn that followed was a stranger. The familiar light that crept over the windowsill seemed to carry a new and heavy weight. In the small cabin, the silence that had once been a shared solitude was now a wall of glass between them, fragile and sharp. They did not speak of the kiss. They did not look at the place where it had happened. They moved around the memory of it, their bodies careful, their eyes fixed on tasks, on the floor, on the far horizon, anywhere but on each other. Jack rose before the sun, the chill of the pre-dawn air a welcome shock to his system. He threw himself into his work with a ferocity that bordered on punishment. He mended fences that weren't broken, chopped wood until his shoulders screamed in protest, and rode the boundaries of his property twice over, pushing his horse and himself to the point of exhaustion. He was trying to outrun the feeling that had taken root in his chest, the ghost of her touch, the taste of her tears on his lips. It was a feeling that had no place in the orderly, barren life he had built for himself. He was a man who had made a pact, a business arrangement sealed with a stamp and sent east. He had ordered a wife, a respectable woman, to fill the empty spaces in his home. Not this wild, wounded creature who had stumbled out of a storm and into the deepest, most fortified parts of him. The kiss felt like a betrayal on two fronts, to the memory of Mary, whose ghost had faded but never truly left, and to the unknown woman whose letter of acceptance was likely already on its way west. He was a man of his word. That was the bedrock of his character, but the bedrock was shaking. Clara, too, sought refuge in labor. She scrubbed the wooden floors until the planks were pale, her knuckles red and raw. She beat the dust from every blanket, washed every dish the moment it was used, and cooked with a silent, desperate focus. Every chore was an act of penance. In her mind, the kiss was her transgression alone. He had offered her shelter, safety, kindness, and she had repaid him with a moment of pathetic, unrestrained weakness. She had seen the flicker of something in his eyes that night, a shared loneliness that had drawn them together, but in the harsh light of day, she saw only her own shame. She was damaged goods, a woman who had fled one man's brutality only to impose her tainted presence on another's decency. She saw the way he avoided her gaze, the stiff set of his shoulders when she entered a room, and interpreted it as revulsion. He was a good man, a man who deserved a good wife, not a ghost-haunted stray who screamed in the night. The thought was a constant, dull ache behind her ribs. I am not worthy. They lived this way for weeks. 2 planets in a tiny solar system, held together by the gravity of the small cabin but kept apart by the vast, cold space of what had passed between them. The air was thick with unspoken words, 1,000 times a day. Jack would turn to say something, about the weather, about a lame calf, anything to break the tension, but the words would die in his throat when he saw the guarded, shuttered look on her face. 1,000 times a day. Clara would want to thank him, to apologize, to explain the terrors that lived inside her, but her own sense of unworthiness sealed her lips. The struggle was a private war waged in the heart of each of them. For Jack, it was a battle between duty and a desire he hadn't known he was still capable of feeling. He would watch Clara as she hung laundry on the line, the wind pressing the thin fabric of her dress against her body, and a fierce, protective feeling would surge through him, followed immediately by a wave of guilt. He had made a promise. He had given his word. For Clara, the war was with the ghosts of her past. Her late husband, a kind but weak man, had been unable to protect her from the cruelties of their employer. His death had left her not only a widow, but also a victim, a status that she felt was branded on her soul. Love, tenderness, a safe harbor, these were things for other women. For whole women, not for broken pieces like herself. One day, Jack announced he was going hunting. He needed meat, but more than that, he needed distance. He needed a full day under the open sky, with nothing but the wind and the hunt to occupy his mind. He packed some jerky in his waterskin, took his rifle from the rack, and left with a curt nod in her direction. "Be back by nightfall," he said, and the words, meant to be reassuring, felt like a command. The cabin felt enormous and empty after he left. For the first time in weeks, Clara could breathe without feeling the weight of his presence. The silence was a relief, but it was also a mirror, reflecting her own loneliness back at her. She went about her chores, but her movements were listless. She found herself tidying the one corner of the cabin that was exclusively his, a small stack of books, a tin of tobacco, and a small, carved wooden box on the mantelpiece. She wasn't a snoop. It was an accident. As she wiped the dust from the mantel, her cloth snagged on the edge of the box, and it tumbled to the floor. The lid, which was not latched, fell open, spilling its meager contents onto the floorboards. A few coins, a tintype of a severe-looking woman she assumed was his mother, and a folded piece of paper. It was the paper that drew her eye. It was a letter, but not one he had received. It was a copy, written in his own rough, angular hand. Curiosity, a powerful and dangerous thing, overcame her. Her hands trembled as she picked it up and unfolded it. The salutation made her stomach clench. "To my future wife." She sank onto the floor, her back against the cool stones of the hearth, and began to read. It was not a love letter. There were no flourishes, no declarations of affection. It was the letter of a man who had stripped his heart down to its barest essentials. "I am writing this as the advertisement requested. My name is Jack Coulter. I own 160 acres of land, mostly for grazing. The house is small, but it is strong against the wind. I have a small herd of cattle that provides a modest living. I am 34 years of age. I am in good health. I am a widower. My wife, Mary, died of the fever 3 years past. I will not speak ill of the dead, nor will I compare you to her. That is a promise. I am not a man of many words or fancy habits. I do not drink to excess, and I am not a gambler. I can offer you a sturdy roof and a full belly. I will be an honest husband. I will not cheat you or raise a hand to you. What I ask for in return is a partner, someone who is not afraid of hard work or the quiet. This is a lonely place. The work is hard, and the comforts are few. I need a woman to make this house a home again. I need a helpmate to share the burdens." Clara's vision began to blur. She read the last lines through a film of tears, her heart constricting with a pain so sharp it took her breath away. Mary, she took the poetry with her when she left this world. I do not expect to find that again. What I need is someone to share the silence with, so it is not so loud. If you are a good, honest woman, and willing to make a life here, that will be enough. That will be everything. Yours, Jack Coulter. She folded the letter, her fingers stroking the creased paper. She wept. She wept for the profound, aching loneliness of this quiet, stoic man. She wept for the good, honest woman who would come and fill his silence. And she wept for herself, because she knew with a certainty that pierced her soul that she could never be that woman. The letter was a testament to his character, his honesty, his decency, his deep, unadorned need. And it was a judgment on her own. He deserved the woman in this letter, a woman of strength and simple virtues. He did not deserve a frightened refugee with a soul full of nightmares. A strange calm settled over her as the tears subsided. A decision, hard and clear as diamond, formed in the ruins of her sorrow. She could not be his wife, but she could give him a gift. She could give him a moment of warmth to sustain him until his real life began. She could offer him the comfort of a woman's body, not as a temptress, but as a final, desperate act of gratitude and healing. It would be a farewell, an absolution for them both. That night, she waited. Jack returned from the hunt, weary and caked in dust, a small buck slung over his shoulder. He seemed relieved to have the deer, a tangible reason for his day away. They ate their dinner in the usual thick silence, but for Clara, it was different. It was the calm before her own storm. After he had cleaned his rifle and settled onto his cot on the far side of the room, she blew out the main lantern, leaving only a single candle flickering on the table, its small flame dancing in the darkness. He was not yet asleep. She could see the faint outline of his body under the thin blanket, see the way his eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. She rose from the bed, his bed, which she had occupied for weeks, and her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought he must surely hear it. She wore only a thin cotton shift, and the cool night air raised goosebumps on her skin. She crossed the space between them. Each footstep on the wooden floor was a drumbeat marking a point of no return. She stopped beside his cot. He turned his head, his eyes widening in the dim light, a question forming on his lips. Before he could speak, she knelt beside him. She reached out a trembling hand and laid it on his chest, over his heart. She could feel its steady, powerful beat beneath her palm. "Clara?" he whispered, his voice rough with confusion and something else. She didn't answer with words. She couldn't. Words were for the good, honest woman from the letter. She had only this. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a kiss utterly different from the first. It was not born of panic or terror, but of a deliberate, heartbreaking tenderness. It was a plea, an offering, and a goodbye, all in one. He did not pull away. A shudder went through his powerful frame. He lifted a hand, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek, his thumb stroking away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. The unspoken questions in his eyes slowly faded, replaced by a deep, sorrowful understanding. He saw the pain in her, the selfless, broken logic of her decision. He sat up and drew her onto the cot with him. There was no lust in his touch, only a profound and gentle reverence. This was not about possession. It was about solace. It was two lonely people in the vast, uncaring wilderness, seeking a moment of sanctuary in each other's arms. Their movements were slow, hesitant, a wordless prayer against the darkness. It was a communion of skin and sorrow, a quiet mending of wounds that went deeper than flesh. For Jack, it was the reawakening of a body he thought had died with his wife. For Clara, it was the first time a man's touch had meant not fear or pain, but a fragile, aching tenderness. In the flickering candlelight, in the deep silence of the prairie night, they healed a small part of each other. Clara was gone before the sun touched the horizon. When Jack awoke, The cabin was still and cold. He reached for her, his hand meeting only empty air. He sat up, his heart sinking with a dreadful certainty. Her few belongings were gone. The bed in the corner, his bed, was neatly made. On the table, in the center of the scrubbed wood surface, was a small, folded piece of paper. His hands shook as he picked it up. The message was only 6 words, written in a neat, careful script. "She deserves you more than I do." A raw, ragged sound tore from his throat. He threw on his clothes and boots, his movements clumsy with panic. He burst out of the cabin. The sky was a bruised purple, and the air was heavy with the smell of rain. He saw her tracks, small and neat, heading east, toward the rising sun and the empty plains. He ran to the barn, saddled his horse with frantic, fumbling hands, and galloped after her. The first drops of rain began to fall as he rode, cold and fat, splattering in the dust. Soon, it was a steady downpour, the first real rain of the season, turning the parched earth to a slick, clinging mud. He cursed the rain, which was already washing away her tracks, but he pushed his horse onward, his eyes scanning the vast, empty landscape. He found her an hour later. She hadn't made it far. She had tried to cross a shallow, dry creek bed, an arroyo, but the sudden rain had turned its clay banks into a slippery trap. She had fallen. She lay in a crumpled heap at the bottom, her face pale, her dark hair plastered to her skin, the rain washing over her. He scrambled down the bank, his boots sliding in the mud. He knelt beside her, his heart in his throat. She was conscious, but weak, shivering violently. He gathered her into his arms, his anger and fear and desperation churning into a single, overwhelming emotion. "What in God's name were you thinking?" he roared, his voice breaking. She didn't answer, only looked at him with those huge, haunted eyes. He carried her out of the arroyo and back to the horse, mounting with difficulty, and held her tight against his chest as they rode back through the driving rain. He kicked the cabin door open and carried her inside, setting her down in a chair by the cold hearth. He was shaking with a fury that was born of terror. He had almost lost her. He had come so close to being alone again in that terrible, loud silence. He stripped off her wet clothes and his own soaked coat, wrapping her in every dry blanket he could find. He built a roaring fire, his movements jerky and violent. Finally, when she had stopped shivering and a little color had returned to her cheeks, he turned to face her. He knelt in front of her, grabbing her hands in his. "Don't you ever do that again," he said, his voice low and raw with emotion. "Don't you ever leave like that. I need you here." It was the closest he had ever come to a declaration. It was everything he was capable of saying. Clara looked at him, her expression full of a deep, unyielding sadness. She gently pulled her hands from his. "You don't understand. Jack," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the drumming of the rain on the roof. "You think you need me now, but you don't." She met his desperate, pleading gaze, and her own was filled with a sorrowful certainty. "Wait until she arrives," she said, her voice soft but final. "Then you will understand." Clara's words hung in the air for 2 weeks, a prophecy and a sentence. "Wait until she arrives. Then you will understand." They lived in a state of suspended animation, the brief, raw honesty between them now buried under a thick layer of dread. The rain had passed, washing the air clean and coaxing a faint blush of green from the hard-packed earth. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere remained heavy and gray, charged with the impending arrival of a woman neither of them knew, a woman who owned the future. The stagecoach was a distant plume of dust before it was a sound. Jack saw it first, from the ridge where he was checking on his cattle. His heart, which had been a dull, steady drum of anxiety, began to pound with a frantic, trapped rhythm. He rode back to the cabin, his face a mask of stone. "The stage is coming," was all he said. Clara, who was kneading dough on the table, froze, her hands white with flour, dropped to her sides. She didn't look at him. She looked at her hands, then at the floor, as if preparing to be erased. She wiped her hands on her apron, retreated to the corner by the hearth, and became a shadow. They stood on the porch together, a strange and silent pair, as the coach rattled to a stop, the horses blowing and stamping in the sudden quiet. The driver, a grizzled man named Silas, tipped his hat. "Got a passenger for you. Coulter, all the way from Pennsylvania." The coach door opened, and she stepped out. Her name was Evelyn, and she was everything the advertisement had promised, and more. She was beautiful, not in the hard, sun-baked way of prairie women, but with a delicate, porcelain fairness that seemed to belong to another world. Her hair was the color of spun gold, pinned up in a neat coil from which a few wisps had escaped to curl at her temple. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue wool, dusty but well-made, and she moved with a quiet grace that was startling in this rough-hewn landscape. She looked fragile, like a wildflower transplanted into a rock garden. But her eyes were not fragile. As she looked from the stark cabin to the vast, empty horizon, there was no fear in them. There was a deep, abiding sadness, and a flicker of something else. Resolve. She carried her own ghosts with her. "Mr. Coulter?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. Jack swallowed, his throat dry. "Ma'am?" he managed, stepping forward and taking the small carpetbag she offered. "Welcome." His eyes met hers, and for a moment he felt a profound sense of shame. This was the woman he had sent for, the good, honest woman who had traveled 2,000 miles on the strength of his promise, and he was about to break that promise before it was even truly made. His gaze flickered past her, toward the cabin door, where Clara stood half hidden in the shadows. Evelyn's sharp eyes missed nothing. She followed his glance and saw the other woman. She saw Clara's plain, patched dress, her work-roughened hands, the way she held herself as if trying to take up as little space as possible, and she saw the raw, unmistakable pain in Clara's averted eyes, a flicker of confusion. Then a dawning, troubled understanding crossed Evelyn's fine features. She said nothing, only gave a polite, almost imperceptible nod in Clara's direction before turning back to Jack. The first evening was an exercise in agony. The tiny cabin, which had felt claustrophobic with two, was now impossibly crowded with three. Evelyn, trying to bridge the chasm of silence, asked polite questions about the ranch, the weather, the nearest town. Jack answered in monosyllables, his voice a low rumble of discomfort. Clara did not speak at all. She served the stew she had made, her movements swift and silent, and refused to sit at the table with them, insisting she would eat later by the hearth. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons against wooden bowls and the crackle of the fire. Evelyn watched them. She watched the way Jack's shoulders would tighten into knots whenever he looked at her, his jaw set like a man facing a firing squad. She watched the way Clara's entire body seemed to shrink whenever Jack spoke, the way she kept her back to them, a rigid wall of misery. There was a history in this room, a story that had played out long before her stagecoach ever crested the horizon. She had not arrived at the beginning of a new life. She had walked into the middle of a tragedy. Her own past had taught her to recognize grief in all its forms. She had lost the man she was to marry in the war, a boy with bright eyes and a quick laugh, cut down at Gettysburg. Afterward, her family, practical and unsentimental, had pushed her to marry another, a wealthy, older merchant she did not love. When she refused, citing her love for a dead man as a vow she would not break. They had called her foolish, then stubborn, then disobedient. Eventually, they had washed their hands of her. Jack Coulter's stark, honest letter had seemed like a lifeline, a chance to build a life on her own terms, free from the judgment of a world that had no room for a woman's grief. She had come here seeking sanctuary, but she had found a different kind of heartbreak. 2 days later, she decided she could not live in the silence any longer. She found Jack by the corral as the sun was setting, casting long, purple shadows across the land. He was tightening a leather strap on a saddle, his movements precise and mechanical, his focus absolute. It was the focus of a man trying to keep his own thoughts at bay. "Jack," she said, her voice making him start. He hadn't heard her approach. He turned, and the guarded, weary look was back on his face. "Ma'am, Evelyn." "We need to speak," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "You owe me the truth. What is it that I have walked into here?" He stopped his work, resting his hands on the saddle. He stared out at the endless prairie, a muscle working in his jaw. For a long moment, he said nothing, and she thought he might refuse to answer. But then, a long, ragged sigh escaped him. "It ain't what you think," he began, his voice low and rough. "Clara, I found her, in a dust storm. She was hurt, running from a bad place. I just meant to help her, to take her to town when she was well." "She seems well enough now," Evelyn stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact. Jack's shoulders slumped. He leaned against the fence, the last of the sun's light catching the deep lines on his face. "Things got complicated." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a wretched, honest guilt. "I've been alone for a long time. Since my Mary passed, the quiet, it gets loud, like I wrote in my letter. I thought all I wanted was a helpmate, a wife to run the house. I thought that would be enough." He took a deep breath. The confession dragged from the deepest part of him. "And then Clara came. She filled the quiet. She made me feel something I thought was buried for good. She made me feel alive again. I never meant for it to happen, but it did." He had confessed it all. The kiss in the dark, the night they had shared, the desperation that had bound them together. He spared neither himself nor Clara, laying the whole broken story at Evelyn's feet. He owed her that. Evelyn listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When he finished, the silence that fell was profound. He expected tears, anger, a demand to be taken back to town at once. He expected her to call him a liar, a cheat. Instead, she was quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. When she finally spoke, her voice was laced with a weary sadness that seemed far older than her years. "So, I am the wife you ordered, but she is the woman who has your heart." "I don't know what I have," Jack admitted, his voice cracking. "I'm just lost." "What you are, Mr. Coulter," she said, turning to face him, her blue eyes clear and steady, "is a man caught between a promise and a feeling. I understand that better than you think." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I will not be a consolation prize, and I will not force you to honor a bargain that your heart cannot keep. But I will not be sent away like a piece of faulty merchandise. Either I have nowhere else to go." Jack stared at her, dumbfounded by her composure, her strength. "So, here's what we will do," she continued, her voice gaining a steely edge. "I will stay for a few weeks. We will all try to live here. We will see if there is a life to be made from these broken pieces, but there is one condition." She took a step closer, and her gaze was unwavering. "You will not touch me, not a hand on my arm, not a comforting gesture, nothing. Do not come to my bed. Do not treat me as your wife. If you are still thinking of her, I will not live in another woman's shadow." And so began the impossible arrangement. 3 people, orbiting each other in a cabin built for one man's solitude. The boundaries were invisible but rigid, the tension a constant, humming presence. Evelyn took over the main bed, Jack's bed, as was her right. Jack moved his cot back to the far side of the room, and Clara, without a word to anyone, gathered her few belongings and moved into the barn. She made a space for herself in the hayloft, a small, clean corner that smelled of dry grass and horses. It was a self-imposed exile, a physical act of removing herself from the equation. She believed it was the only honorable thing to do. She was the complication, the unwelcome ghost at the feast. By removing herself from the house, she was trying to give Jack and Evelyn the space to become what they were supposed to be. But Evelyn would not allow her to simply disappear. The morning after Clara moved to the barn, Evelyn appeared at the bottom of the ladder, holding a steaming plate of eggs and biscuits and a cup of coffee. "You need to eat," she said, her voice soft. Clara, perched in the loft's opening, stared down at her. "You don't have to do that, ma'am." "My name is Evelyn," she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And I know I don't have to. I'm doing it because I want to." She set the plate on a crate near the ladder. "I will leave it here for you." She did it every morning. It became a ritual. Evelyn would bring the food. They would exchange a few quiet words, and Evelyn would leave. It was an offering of peace, an act of kindness that Clara didn't know how to accept. This woman, who should have hated her, was treating her with a respect and decency that was utterly disarming. It was a gesture that said, "I see you. You are not invisible." For Jack, the days were a special kind of hell. He was caught between two women, two duties, two opposing magnetic poles. He felt a deep sense of obligation to Evelyn. She was his intended, a woman of grace and courage who did not deserve this tangled mess. He admired her strength, was humbled by her compassion. He would watch her move about the cabin, bringing a light and order to it that he had forgotten. And a part of him would wish desperately that he could be the man she deserved, the man he had promised to be in his letter. But then he would see Clara, crossing the yard from the barn, her shoulders slightly stooped, and the feeling that had reawakened him would surge through his veins, a powerful, undeniable current. His heart ached for her. He saw her exile in the barn as a punishment she had inflicted on herself, and his guilt was a physical weight. He had brought both of these women to this place, to this pain. The nights were the worst. He would lie on his cot, just a few feet away from Evelyn in his bed, and the air would be thick with unspoken things. He could hear the soft sound of her breathing, sense her wakefulness in the dark. He knew what was expected of him. He knew that as her husband-to-be, he should cross that small space, lie with her, and begin the life they had agreed upon. But Evelyn's condition was a brand on his conscience. "Don't touch me if you're still thinking of her." And he was always thinking of her. He could feel Clara's presence across the yard in the barn as if she were a phantom limb, a part of him that had been severed but still ached. One night, a week into their strange cohabitation, the tension finally snapped. A coyote was howling somewhere on the prairie, a lonely, mournful sound. He saw Evelyn stir in the bed. "Jack," she whispered into the darkness. "I'm here," he answered, his voice thick. She was silent for a moment. Then, "This isn't working, is it?" He had no answer for that. She shifted, turning to face him, a pale shape in the moonlight slanting through the window. "Come here," she said, her voice barely audible. "Just lie with me. Not as a husband, just so I don't feel so alone." His heart constricted. It was a plea he couldn't refuse. He rose from his cot and went to the bed, slipping under the covers beside her. The space was charged with a painful, electric tension. She was beautiful, and she smelled of lavender soap. She was everything a man was supposed to want. He lay on his back, stiff as a board, staring at the ceiling. She tentatively reached out and placed her hand on his chest. Her touch was light, cool. He didn't flinch, but inside, he was recoiling. It felt wrong. It felt like a lie. He was acutely aware of her warmth beside him, and just as aware of the cold, empty space in his own soul. He could not bring himself to touch her back, to offer her the simple comfort she had asked for. His body was a traitor to his own good intentions. After a long, agonizing silence, she slowly withdrew her hand. He heard a small, choked sound. In the faint light, He saw a single tear trace a silver path down her cheek. She quickly turned away from him, her back a rigid line of rejection. Evelyn wept silently in the dark, her shoulders shaking with quiet, repressed sobs. And Jack lay beside her, a prisoner in his own bed, realizing with sickening clarity that she was right. She was living in the shadow of another woman, and the shadow was so dark it was extinguishing them all. The morning broke, cold and clear, offering no comfort. The memory of the night before, of Evelyn's silent tears in the darkness, lay between them like a shroud. Jack rose and left the cabin without a word, the slam of the door a final, helpless admission of his failure. Evelyn lay still for a long time, watching the dust motes dance in the pale shafts of sunlight. The tears were gone, replaced by a hard, clear certainty. She could not live like this, a ghost in her own life, haunted by a love that was not hers. The silence had to be broken, and she was the only one with the strength to break it. She rose, dressed, and stoked the fire. She made coffee, the familiar ritual a small anchor in the churning sea of her thoughts. Then, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders against the morning chill, she walked out of the cabin and across the yard to the barn. The air inside was cool and smelled of hay, leather, and the warm, living presence of the animals. A soft lowing came from one of the stalls. Light filtered in dusty stripes through the cracks in the walls. She saw the ladder leading to the hayloft and began to climb. Clara was awake. She was sitting on her pallet of blankets, mending one of Jack's shirts, her fingers moving with a practiced, steady rhythm. She looked up as Evelyn's head appeared over the edge of the loft, and her hands stilled in her lap. A guarded, fearful expression clouded her face. She looked like a cornered animal, ready to flee. Evelyn pulled herself into the loft and sat on a bale of hay a few feet away, creating a space between them that was respectful but resolute. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Two women from different worlds, bound together by the love and failings of one man. "He couldn't touch me last night," Evelyn said, her voice quiet but stripped of all artifice. It was a statement of fact, not an accusation. Clara flinched as if struck. She looked down at the shirt in her lap, her knuckles white. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't want your sorrow, Clara," Evelyn said, her voice softening slightly. "I want the truth, the whole truth. It's the only thing that can save any of us now." She leaned forward, her gaze intense and unwavering. She asked the question that had been poisoning the air between them since the day she arrived, the question she had to hear answered before she could take another step. "Did you lie with him?" Clara's head snapped up, her dark eyes, filled with a universe of pain, met Evelyn's. She did not cry. She did not offer excuses or justifications. Her entire being seemed to gather itself into a single, painful act of honesty. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. The truth, once spoken, hung in the dusty air. Evelyn let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. There was a strange relief in it, the clean pain of a lance to a wound. I don't know if it was right or wrong," Clara finally whispered, her voice ragged. "All I know is that we were two lonely people, and the darkness was so big." Evelyn nodded, a deep, unexpected wave of empathy washing over her. "The darkness," she repeated softly. "Yes, I know the darkness." And then the dam broke, not in a flood of tears, but in a quiet, steady stream of words. Evelyn spoke first. She told Clara about William, her fiancé, about his letters from the front, full of boyish bravado and love, and about the final, formal letter from the War Department that had shattered her world. She spoke of her family's cold practicality, their insistence that she forget, that she move on, that she marry a man for security and status. She spoke of what it felt like to be disowned, to be told that her grief and her loyalty were an inconvenience, to be made a stranger in her own home. As she spoke, she saw a profound change in Clara. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a look of deep, sorrowful recognition. When Evelyn finished, her story hanging in the quiet of the loft, Clara began to speak. Her voice was hesitant at first, unused to sharing the burdens she carried. She told Evelyn about her husband, Thomas, a good but gentle man who had been no match for the brutal world they lived in. She spoke of the tyrannical rancher they had worked for, a man whose cruelty was a sport. She described, in faltering, broken sentences, the day the rancher had beaten Thomas to death over a perceived slight, and the terror that had sent her fleeing into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back. She spoke of her nightmares, of the feeling of being tainted, broken, unworthy of the safety and kindness Jack had shown her. They were no longer rivals. In the quiet, hay-scented loft, they were just two women, sharing the litany of their losses. They had been shaped and scarred by a world that saw them as property, as afterthoughts, as vessels for the ambitions and griefs of men. They were both survivors of different kinds of wars, and they recognized the battle weariness in each other's souls. They had been held captive their whole lives, by love, by loss, by duty, by the expectations of a society that had drawn the boundaries of their lives without their consent. A silent understanding passed between them, deeper than any words. Clara picked up the shirt she had been mending. Evelyn reached out and, taking the needle and thread, began to finish the seam with small, neat stitches. It was a simple, shared gesture that sealed a new and unspoken pact. That afternoon, Clara came back into the cabin. She didn't retreat to the hearth but walked to the kitchen counter where Evelyn was peeling potatoes. Without a word, she picked up another knife and began to help. Jack, coming in from the yard, stopped dead in the doorway, staring at the scene. The two women worked together, a new, tentative rhythm forming between them. They moved with a shared, intuitive grace, a glance to signal the need for salt, a hand held out to receive a bowl, a small, almost imperceptible nod of thanks. Their conversation was sparse, limited to the tasks at hand, but the silence was no longer tense or hostile. It was companionable, comfortable. Jack felt like an intruder in his own home. He watched them, baffled and awed by the quiet alliance that had formed. He had been the center of their conflict, the prize to be won or the burden to be borne. Now, he was an outsider, observing a mystery he could not comprehend. He saw the way Evelyn would sometimes put a gentle hand on Clara's arm, a small, grounding gesture. He saw the way Clara would look at Evelyn with a dawning gratitude, a trust that was slowly, painfully, being born. Something profound was changing, shifting the very foundations of his world, and he had no part in it. A few nights later, a storm rolled in. One of those violent prairie tempests that made the sturdy cabin feel like a ship on a raging sea. The wind howled, and rain lashed against the windows in blinding sheets. Jack had been out securing the animals, and he stumbled into the cabin, soaked to the bone and shivering, his hair plastered to his forehead. The main room was empty, but a low light came from the kitchen, and he could hear voices, a soft, murmuring counterpoint to the fury of the storm outside. He walked to the doorway, and the scene before him stopped his heart. Evelyn and Clara were sitting at the small kitchen table, a single lantern casting a warm, golden glow on their faces. They were talking, their heads close together, as he watched, unseen. Clara's face crumpled, a silent sob shaking her shoulders as some painful memory surfaced. Evelyn didn't speak. She simply reached out, pulled Clara into her arms, and held her. She held her tightly, rocking her gently, her hand stroking Clara's hair. It was not an embrace of pity. It was an embrace of pure, unadulterated empathy. It was the fierce, protective hold of someone who understood, who had weathered her own storms and recognized the wreckage in another. Jack stood frozen, witnessing an intimacy so profound it made his own clumsy attempts at comfort seem brutish and shallow. He was not jealous. He was humbled. In that moment, He understood that what these two women were building together was something outside his experience, something born not of desire, but of shared pain and a deep, resonant strength. He saw them not as his problem to solve, but as two souls finding their own way to heal. Eventually, Clara's sobs subsided. She pulled away, wiping her eyes, and gave Evelyn a watery, grateful smile. She saw Jack then, standing in the doorway, and a flicker of the old fear returned to her eyes. She rose quickly and, with a mumbled good night, fled to the barn, leaving the echo of her grief behind. Evelyn watched her go, her expression full of compassion. Then she turned to Jack. She gestured to the chair Clara had just vacated. He came and sat, dripping water onto the floor. The storm raged outside. Inside, a strange, transformative calm had settled. Evelyn sat down beside him at the table. She looked at his tired, confused face, at his hands, which were clenched into fists on the table, and she felt a wave of affection for this good, lost man. "You see, don't you?" she said softly. "You've been trying to choose. You think you have to choose between your promise to me and your feelings for her, between your past and your present." He looked at her, his eyes pleading for an answer he didn't have. She reached out, not to touch him, but to hover her hand over his clenched fists, a gesture of profound tenderness. "You're wrong, Jack," she said, her voice clear and steady above the storm. "That's the cage we've all been living in, the one the world builds for us, but we don't have to stay in it." She finally looked him directly in the eye, and what he saw there was not jealousy or resignation, but a brave, astonishing light. "We don't have to choose," she said. "We just have to love." The words hung in the air, a heresy and a revelation. Love not as a possession, not as a contract, but as a force, as a shelter, as the answer. It was a terrifying, radical idea. And in the heart of the storm, it felt like the only truth. From that night on, the transition began. It was slow, clumsy, and full of a breathtaking sincerity. Clara did not move back into the house. Not yet, but she no longer ate by the hearth or fled at the end of the day. The three of them began to take their meals together at the table. The conversations were stilted at first, full of awkward pauses, but they were trying. They talked about the ranch, about the coming winter, about small, safe things. They were learning a new language, the language of us instead of you and I. Jack found himself watching them, learning from them. He saw how Evelyn would draw Clara out with a gentle question, how Clara would silently anticipate a need of Evelyn's, placing a cup of tea at her elbow without being asked. He started to participate, not as a judge or a prize, but as a partner. He would tell them about his day, about a calf that was struggling, and listen as they offered their own thoughts, their own quiet wisdom. The rigid lines of morality and duty began to blur, replaced by the simple, daily acts of caring for one another. They were, against all odds, becoming a family. The final wall came down on a cold, clear night a week later. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and the sky littered with a million brilliant stars. They had finished their supper, and for the first time, Clara had lingered in the cabin, not feeling the urgent need to retreat to the solitude of the barn. They sat before the fire, the comfortable silence having returned. But this time it was a silence of peace, not tension. Evelyn was tending to a small rope burn on Clara's hand, her touch gentle and practiced. Jack sat on the other side, watching the firelight play on their faces, on their bent heads. A feeling of overwhelming gratitude washed over him, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. These two women, in their infinite grace and strength, had saved him from himself. When Evelyn had finished bandaging the burn, she didn't let go of Clara's hand. She held it, her thumb stroking the back of Clara's knuckles. Clara, who would have once snatched her hand away, let it rest in Evelyn's, a quiet surrender. Then Evelyn looked at Jack. She held out her other hand to him, an invitation. His heart hammered in his chest. This was the precipice. He looked at her hand, then at her face, which was filled with a calm, loving resolve. He looked at Clara, who watched him with wide, vulnerable eyes. Her future held in that single, suspended moment. He was afraid. But for the first time, his fear was smaller than his hope. Slowly, he reached out and took Evelyn's hand. And there they were. 3 people, joined together in the firelight. A circle of hands, a circle of souls. Evelyn was the bridge between them, the anchor for them both. The warmth of their hands spread through him, a current of profound, unspoken truth. This was not about desire or possession. It was about acceptance. It was about creating a space safe enough for all of their broken pieces to exist together. Evelyn gently pulled their hands closer, drawing them into a small, tight circle of 3. Jack moved from his chair to sit on the floor with them, their knees touching. He could feel the warmth of Clara's leg next to his, the gentle pressure of Evelyn's hand. No one spoke. There were no words for what was happening. It was a moment that transcended all the boundaries of tradition, of everything they had ever been taught was right or wrong. It was haunting, terrifying, and in its own strange way, deeply sacred, in the heart of the vast, lonely wilderness, under the silent gaze of the stars. 3 solitary souls chose not to be alone anymore. They chose to love. Their fragile peace, woven in the quiet moments inside the cabin, could not survive contact with the outside world. The wilderness had been their sanctuary, a vast, empty canvas on which they could paint a new kind of life, but they could not remain on their island forever. They needed supplies, flour, salt, coffee, lamp oil, and a trip to the town of Harmony Creek was unavoidable. They went together, all 3 of them in the buckboard wagon. It was not a conscious decision to make a statement, but a simple, practical one. Jack could not leave them alone, and they would not be left to them. It felt natural. They were a unit, a family, to the small, tightly laced community of Harmony Creek. They were a spectacle. It began in the general store. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor's wife, a woman whose piety was matched only by her curiosity, watched them with narrowed, assessing eyes. She saw the way Jack stood between the 2 women, not as a man with a wife and a sister, or a wife and a servant, but as something else entirely. She saw the easy, unspoken communication between Clara and Evelyn as they selected fabrics. She saw Jack look to both of them for an opinion on a new axe handle, his deference equal, his attention divided in a way that was unnatural, unsettling. By the time they had loaded their supplies and were preparing to leave, the whispers had already begun. Heads turned as they walked down the dusty main street. Curtains were twitched aside in windows. The stares were not merely curious, they were hard, judgmental, thick with a prurient suspicion. The air, which had been clear and welcoming on their arrival, was now heavy with condemnation. They felt it like a change in the weather, a sudden, chilling drop in temperature. They retreated into the silence of the wagon, the 3 of them sitting close together on the hard wooden seat, not for warmth, but for protection against the unseen barbs being hurled at their backs. The ride home was quiet, each of them lost in the new, uncomfortable awareness that their private world had been breached. The whispers in Harmony Creek fermented for a week, growing from gossip into rumor, and from rumor into righteous indignation. The story twisted and grew with each telling. It was no longer just a strange living arrangement. It was a den of iniquity, a brazen flouting of God's law out on the prairie, a moral infection that had to be cleansed. The cleansing arrived in the form of the Reverend Miller. He was a gaunt, fire and brimstone preacher with eyes like burning coals and a belief in his own righteousness that was as vast and unyielding as the prairie itself. He saw sin everywhere, and in the story of Jack Coulter's ranch, he saw a particularly foul and seductive strain that had to be publicly stamped out. He did not come alone. He brought with him a small, grim-faced congregation, a handful of men and women from the town who considered themselves the guardians of its morality. They arrived in 2 wagons late one afternoon, a black-clad army of judgment rolling up to the small, peaceful cabin. Jack, Evelyn, and Clara were in the small garden they had started together, a hopeful patch of green in the dusty yard. They looked up, first with curiosity, then with a dawning, cold dread. Jack straightened up, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the handle of the axe he'd been using to break up the soil. "Mr. Coulter," Reverend Miller called out, his voice a commanding boom that echoed in the quiet air. He remained in the wagon, looking down on them as if from a pulpit. "We have come to speak with you about the state of your soul. We have come to deliver you from the pit of sin you have dug for yourself and these women." His eyes swept over Evelyn and Clara with a look of profound disgust. The other townspeople began to climb down from the wagons, their faces hard and unforgiving. They formed a semicircle, trapping the 3 of them against the cabin. "There's nothing to talk about, Reverend," Jack said, his voice a low growl. "This is my land. You're not welcome here. You should leave." "We will not leave until God's work is done," one of the women shrieked. "Abomination!" The word was like a lit match. The mob surged forward. It was not a riot. It was something uglier, a slow, deliberate act of sanctimonious destruction. 2 men strode past Jack and kicked over the neat rows of young plants, stomping the tender green shoots into the dirt. Another threw open the cabin door. "This house must be cleansed of its filth," the Reverend declared. Jack moved then, a roar of fury tearing from his throat. But 2 of the largest men grabbed his arms. Pinning him, he struggled, his muscles cording with rage, but they were strong, and he was outnumbered. He could only watch, helpless, as they invaded his home. What followed was a methodical violation. They didn't simply break things, they defiled them. A woman took Evelyn's small, treasured collection of books from the mantelpiece and tore the pages out, scattering them like profane confetti. Someone found Clara's neatly folded clothes and threw them onto the dirt floor, grinding them underfoot. They smashed the jars of preserves the women had put up together. They were not just destroying property. They were trying to erase the life the 3 of them had built, to smash the small, fragile vessel of their happiness. Evelyn and Clara stood frozen in the yard, their faces white with shock and terror. The verbal assault was as violent as the physical one. "Harlot!" a man spat at Evelyn, his face contorted with righteous hate. "Coming here to tempt a good man into wickedness." "And you," a woman sneered at Clara, her voice dripping with venom. "The sinner's shadow, a creature of the dark, wallowing in your own shame." The words struck them harder than any physical blow. For Evelyn, harlot was the echo of her family's judgment, the ultimate condemnation for a woman who dared to live outside their rules. For Clara, sinner was the confirmation of her deepest, most secret fear that she was irrevocably tainted, a source of corruption. One of the men, emboldened by the frenzy, lunged toward Evelyn, grabbing her arm. "You need a lesson in modesty, woman!" She cried out, trying to pull away, and he backhanded her across the face. The sharp crack of the blow silenced the yard for a half-second. Evelyn stumbled back, a red mark blooming on her cheek, her eyes wide with shock and pain. That was the moment Jack broke. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, he threw the 2 men holding him aside as if they were children. He lunged into the cabin, his face a mask of murderous rage, and came out a second later holding his rifle. He levered around into the chamber, the metallic shick-shick of the action a sound more final and terrifying than any sermon. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, the barrel aimed squarely at the chest of the man who had struck Evelyn. The yard went deathly still. The mob's righteous fury evaporated, replaced by the primal, animal fear of death. The man who had hit Evelyn held up his hands, his face pale. "Now, hold on, Coulter," Reverend Miller said, his voice losing its booming confidence. There's no need for that. We are men of God. Get off my land, Jack snarled, his voice a low, shaking whisper of pure rage. Get off my land before I send every last one of you to meet your God right now. They scrambled back to their wagons, their piety forgotten in their haste to escape the madman with the rifle. They fled, leaving a wake of destruction and hatred behind them. Jack stood there, the rifle still raised, until the wagons were a plume of dust on the horizon. Then, the rage seemed to drain out of him, leaving a terrifying void. He lowered the gun, his hands shaking. He looked at the trampled garden, the violated cabin. He looked at Evelyn, who stood holding a hand to her bruised cheek, tears silently streaming down her face. He looked at Clara, who had collapsed to her knees, her body shaking with great, silent sobs of despair. He had failed them. He had brought this down on them. He couldn't fix it. He couldn't fight it. The rage, finding no other outlet, turned on himself. He let out a raw, anguished cry, threw the rifle to the ground, and turned and ran. He ran blindly, away from the cabin, away from their tears, away from his own crushing failure. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, plunging deep into the woods that bordered his property, a wild animal seeking a dark place to lick its wounds. The two women were left alone in the wreckage. The fragile peace they had built was shattered. The sanctuary had been desecrated. Clara, huddled on the ground, was lost in a maelstrom of self-loathing. It was her fault. She was the sinner, the complication. If she had never stumbled out of that storm, none of this would have happened. Jack would have his respectable wife, and their lives would be clean and simple. She was a blight, a disease, and she had infected them all. She had to leave. She would wait until dark, and then she would slip away, back into the wilderness where she belonged. It was the only way to save them. Evelyn, her cheek throbbing, looked at the devastation and felt a different kind of despair. She was the burden. She was the promise Jack couldn't keep, the respectable face that had made their private arrangement so publicly offensive. If she had never answered his letter, he and Clara might have found a quiet, simple happiness. Her presence, her claim on him, had made them a target. She had fled judgment only to bring a harsher judgment down on the two people who had shown her more kindness than her own family. She, too, thought of leaving. She could walk to town, take the next stagecoach east, and disappear, freeing them from the trouble she had brought. All day, they existed in a haze of misery, each trapped in her own separate prison of guilt. They didn't speak of leaving, but the thought was a palpable presence between them. The only logical solution to an impossible problem. Their small, brave new world had been tried by the court of public opinion, and it had been found wanting. It was over. Jack returned at dusk, a ghost emerging from the trees. The rage was gone, burned out of him, leaving only a hollow, aching exhaustion. He saw the cabin, dark and silent, and the fear that had been chasing him all day finally caught him. He was terrified they would be gone. He found them inside, sitting in the midst of the wreckage, two pale, silent figures in the gloom. They looked up as he entered, their faces etched with a sorrow so deep it mirrored his own. He didn't have the words to fix what was broken. He only had one, desperate, primal need. Don't leave me. He walked to the center of the room and fell to his knees before them. The gesture was so uncharacteristic, so completely devoid of his usual stoic pride, that it shocked them out of their stupor. He reached out, taking one of each of their hands, his grip desperate. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking, the words torn from his soul. "I'm so sorry. I brought this on you." He looked from Evelyn's bruised face to Clara's tear-stained one. "Please," he begged, his head bowed. "Whatever you do, please don't leave. Don't leave me alone in this." Before either of them could answer, a strange, new light filled the room, an ominous, flickering orange glow, and with it came a new sound, a low, distant roar, like a great beast waking from its slumber, and the smell, the sharp, acrid smell of smoke. Jack shot to his feet and ran to the door. He threw it open, and the three of them stared in horror. The entire western horizon was on fire. A wildfire, pushed by a strong, dry wind, was sweeping across the prairie. A solid wall of flame and smoke, and it was heading directly for them. Nature, in its terrifying indifference, had rendered the town's judgment meaningless. The world was about to be cleansed by a fire far more real and terrible than any preacher could conjure. There was no more time for sorrow or guilt. There was only survival. "The well!" Jack yelled, his voice snapping with command. "Grab every bucket, every blanket you can find. Soak them!" Adrenaline surged through them, a clean, sharp antidote to their despair. They moved as one, a single organism with a single purpose: to live. They worked in a frantic, desperate rhythm against the roaring tide of fire. The heat was a physical blow, the smoke a choking blanket. Embers, like malevolent orange stars, rained down around them, starting smaller fires that had to be stamped out with their feet. Jack was a whirlwind of motion, his earlier despair replaced by a fierce, focused determination. He worked the pump at the well until his arms screamed, filling bucket after bucket. Evelyn and Clara, their faces smudged with soot, their lungs burning, hauled the heavy buckets, dousing the walls of the cabin and the barn, beating at the encroaching flames with wet, heavy blankets. The world shrank to this single, desperate battle. There was no past, no future, only the searing heat of the present. The roar of the fire was a deafening, constant presence, swallowing all other sound. Sweat stung their eyes, mingling with ash and tears. They were no longer a man and two women, a complicated tangle of love and duty. They were three human beings fighting for their home, for their lives, against an elemental rage. The barn was the first to go. A gust of wind carried a shower of embers onto its dry, wooden roof, and in seconds, it was engulfed in flames. A cry of despair escaped Clara. It was more than a building. It had been her refuge. She watched it burn, mesmerized by the terrible beauty of the destruction. A large, flaming beam from the roof crashed down, blocking the main door. Then she heard it, a terrified, high-pitched screaming from within. "The horses! The horses!" she shrieked, her voice thin against the roar. Without a thought, she ran toward the back of the barn, toward a smaller side door she knew was there. "Clara, no!" Jack yelled, but she was already gone, disappearing into the smoke. "I'll get more water," Evelyn screamed at Jack, turning back toward the well. Clara found the side door, her hands fumbling with the hot latch. She managed to wrench it open and plunged into the choking, blinding inferno. The heat was unimaginable. She could hear the horses screaming, their eyes wild with terror. She untied the first one, slapping its rump and sending it galloping out into the relative safety of the yard. As she turned to the second, another flaming beam crashed down from the loft where she had slept, landing between her and the door. She was trapped. The smoke filled her lungs, and the world began to spin, the roar of the fire turning into a dizzying rush in her ears. She sank to her knees, her last conscious thought one of utter, final despair. Evelyn, returning from the well with 2 full buckets, saw the beam fall. She saw that Clara had not come out. A terror colder and sharper than any fire seized her. She dropped the buckets and ran toward the burning barn. "Clara!" she screamed. She reached the side door and saw Clara, a crumpled shape on the floor, the flames just feet away and closing in. There was no time to think. She took a deep breath, pulled the wet shawl from her shoulders, held it over her mouth and nose, and ran inside. She grabbed Clara under the arms, her own dress starting to smolder from the heat, with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She dragged Clara's dead weight back toward the door, her lungs on fire, her vision blurring. She stumbled out into the yard, collapsing onto the ground beside Clara, both of them gasping for air as the barn roof finally caved in with a deafening crash. Jack, having saved the cabin from the main fire front, ran to them. He saw them lying there, covered in soot. Evelyn's dress burned, her arms red with angry burns. Clara was unconscious, a nasty gash on her forehead from a falling ember. He fell to his knees beside them, his heart shattering. The main fire front passed, leaving a blackened, smoldering landscape in its wake. The wind still howled, whipping smoke and ash into the air. The cabin was saved, but the barn was gone. The garden was gone. The world was a ruin of black and gray. Jack gathered the two injured women into his arms, pulling them close. He held Evelyn's burned hands. He touched the gash on Clara's forehead. They had fought for this place. They had saved each other. In the face of nature's fury, they had proven what their small, human world refused to accept. They were a family. And as he knelt there, in the ruins of his ranch, surrounded by the devastation, holding the two women he loved more than his own life, Jack Coulter did something he hadn't done since Mary died. He bowed his head against the howling wind, and amidst the ashes and the smoke, he began to pray. It was not a formal prayer. It was a raw, broken, desperate plea, whispered into the smoldering darkness. A man's shattered heart offered up to a God he had long thought silent. From the ashes, a new world was born. The first few weeks after the fire were a blur of back-breaking labor. A silent, shared penance performed under a sky still hazy with smoke. The air tasted of char and loss. Their world was a monochrome landscape of black and gray. The only color, the angry red of Evelyn's burns and the deep purple of the bruise on her cheek. But in the shared work, there was a new kind of intimacy, a language spoken in the swing of a hammer, the passing of a saw, the quiet dressing of each other's wounds at the end of each exhausting day. They did not rebuild the barn. Instead, they focused on the cabin, salvaging what they could from the blackened timbers and felling new trees from the woods that the fire had, by some miracle, spared. Jack, with the help of the two women, raised a new structure. It was smaller than the original, with no wasted space, every beam and plank serving a purpose. The fire had burned away everything that was not essential, and they rebuilt their home in the same spirit. What emerged was less a ranch house and more a fortress of solitude, a cozy, three-room haven that turned its back on the world and looked inward. Clara and Evelyn worked side by side, chinking the logs with a mixture of mud and grass, their hands moving in a now familiar harmony. The home they built was not Jack's house that they happened to live in. It was theirs, consecrated by their sweat and sealed with their shared will to survive. Slowly, signs of life returned. A few weeks after the fire, a determined green shoot pushed its way through the blackened soil of the garden. Evelyn saw it first and let out a small cry of joy, calling the others over. The three of them knelt around that tiny speck of green, a fragile promise in a world of ruin, and for the first time since the fire, they all smiled. Their isolation was broken by necessity. The fire had taken most of their winter stores, and with their cattle scattered and the garden gone, the specter of starvation was a real and present threat. The journey to Harmony Creek was not one they looked forward to, but it had to be made. They went in the buckboard, a silent, grim-faced trio, expecting the same hostility and judgment as before. But the fire had changed more than just the landscape. The blaze that had threatened Jack's ranch had been part of a larger firestorm that had swept across the prairie, menacing other, more established homesteads. As Jack drove the wagon into town, he saw a group of men, including some who had been part of the mob, gathered outside the livery stable. Their faces were grim. Their talk was of lost cattle, of herds driven mad by the smoke and scattered for miles, many likely dead or dying of thirst in the scorched wilderness. One of the men, a rancher named Peterson, who had been particularly vocal in his condemnation, looked at Jack with a new, desperate kind of respect. "Coulter," he said, his voice rough, You're the best tracker in this county. We're putting together a group to go looking for what's left of our herds. We could use your eyes." Jack looked at the man, then at the others. He saw no apology in their faces, but he did see a grudging need that was more powerful than pride. He looked back at Evelyn and Clara in the wagon. They both gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not about forgiveness. It was about survival, and about being part of a community, for better or worse. "I'll go," Jack said simply. For a week, he rode with the men, pushing himself and his horse to the limits. He found trails no one else could see, read signs in the ash-covered ground that were invisible to the others. He led them to a hidden canyon where hundreds of panicked cattle had taken refuge. He helped them round up the terrified, half-starved animals and drive them back toward what was left of their ranches. He worked harder than any of them, spoke less than any of them, and earned a new, unspoken respect. They still didn't understand his life, but they understood his character. He was a man you wanted beside you when the world was burning. The thaw continued a few weeks later. A wave of fever swept through Harmony Creek, hitting the children the hardest. The town's doctor was old and overwhelmed. When the Petersons' youngest boy took a turn for the worse, his breathing growing shallow and ragged. A desperate Mrs. Peterson, the same woman who had shrieked, "Abomination!" in his yard, sent her oldest son to fetch Jack Coulter. She had heard the story of how his first wife, Mary, had been a healer, skilled with herbs and folk remedies, and that she had taught her husband much of what she knew. Jack came without hesitation. He brought Evelyn with him, for her hands were gentler and her knowledge of fevers, learned in the more crowded towns of the East, was more sophisticated than his. They stayed by the boy's bedside for 2 days and 2 nights, applying cool compresses, spooning a willow bark tea between his cracked lips, and talking to him in low, soothing voices. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. When Jack and Evelyn finally left the Peterson house, exhausted but successful, the way the town looked at them had changed. The stares were no longer hard with judgment. They were filled with a kind of baffled wonder. These people, these sinners, had shown more Christian charity than the Reverend himself. The whispers didn't stop, but their tone shifted. They were no longer condemnations. They were legends. The legend reached the city in the valise of Dr. Alistair Finch. He was a physician from St. Louis, traveling west to document the health and habits of the frontier for a medical journal. He stopped in Harmony Creek to rest his horses and heard the strange, compelling story of the Coulter Ranch. Intrigued, he hired a guide and rode out to see it for himself. He was not what they expected. He was a quiet, thoughtful man with kind eyes and an open mind. He did not come to judge, he came to understand. He stayed with them for 3 days, sharing their simple meals, listening to their story. He spoke with Jack about tracking and ranching, with Evelyn about books and medicine, and with Clara about the resilience of the human spirit. He saw the easy, loving way they moved around each other, the shared glances, the intuitive understanding. He saw their home, small but filled with a palpable peace. Before he left, he sat with them on the new porch they had built. "In the city," he said, his gaze on the healing landscape, "we have so many rules, so many structures, that we often forget what it is they are meant to protect. We build fences around our lives and our hearts. You have been through a fire that burned all the fences down, and you have discovered something essential about what it means to be a family." 2 months later, a copy of a St. Louis newspaper made its way to Harmony Creek. In it was an article by Dr. Finch. It did not mention them by name, referring to them only as a prairie family. It was titled, "A Story of 3 Hearts, on Finding Grace Beyond the Fences of Convention." He wrote of their courage, their resilience, and the profound, unconventional love that bound them together. He did not portray them as sinners or curiosities, but as pioneers of a different sort, exploring not a new land, but a new way for the human heart to live. The article was read aloud in the general store, and a thoughtful, Respectful silence fell over the small crowd. They had been living next to a legend and had been too blind to see it. The article was the final piece. It gave them a legitimacy that no sermon could take away. It was an affirmation, a shield, and it gave Jack the courage to do what he knew in his heart he must do. One autumn afternoon, when the sky was a deep, impossible blue and the air was crisp with the promise of coming cold, he asked them to walk with him. He led them to the far side of the property, to a spot that had been miraculously spared by the fire. There stood a single, old apple tree, its branches gnarled but heavy with fruit. It was the only apple tree for 100 miles, planted by the first homesteader on this land, a stubborn testament to survival. He stopped beneath its branches. He turned to them, his face serious, his heart in his eyes. He took one of Evelyn's hands and one of Clara's. "I have no church to offer you," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I have no preacher to bless us. I only have this land, this sky, and this heart, which you both have saved. I made a promise to one of you in a letter, and I made a different kind of promise to the other in the dark. I want to make a new promise now, to both of you, before the only God that matters, the one who planted this tree and who brought you both to me." He looked first at Evelyn. "Evelyn," he said, his voice thick, "you came here expecting a husband and a home. You found a broken man and a half-made life. You met it all with a grace and a strength that humbled me. You taught me that love is not about possession, but about making space for others. Will you be my wife, my partner, and the foundation of our home?" Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes as she whispered, "I will." Then he turned to Clara. Her hand was trembling in his. "Clara," he said, his voice softening, "you came here with nothing but the ghosts of your past. You thought you were not worthy of love, but you taught me what it is to be alive again. You are the wild, brave heart of this family. You taught me that love is not about duty, but about a fire in the soul. Will you be my wife, my partner, and the heart of our home?" Clara could not speak. She only nodded, a great shuddering sob of joy and release shaking her body. He slipped a simple ring, a band of woven prairie grass, onto each of their fingers, and there, under the branches of the lone apple tree, with the wind as their witness, they became husband and wives. Their wedding night was not spent in one room, but in the whole of their small, new home. They built a fire in the hearth, and its light danced on the walls they had raised together. There was no awkwardness, no jealousy, only a profound and tender truth. It was a night of quiet celebration, of shared stories whispered in the firelight. They shed tears for the people they had been, for the pain they had endured to get to this place, and they held each other, sometimes all three in a tangle of arms and legs on a pallet of blankets before the fire, sometimes in pairs, offering quiet comfort and rediscovering each other in this new, sacred context. It was a slow, gentle healing. Old wounds were not forgotten, but they were cleansed in the warmth of their absolute acceptance of one another. They were finally, truly home. The seasons turned. The harsh winter gave way to a gentle spring, and the prairie, resilient and forgiving, came alive with a carpet of wildflowers. And with the spring came new life. It was Evelyn who knew first. She saw the subtle changes in Clara, the new weariness, the faint blue veins that appeared on her breasts. The birth came on a hot summer night, with a thunderstorm raging outside, a wild echo of the storm that had first brought them all together. Clara's labor was long and difficult. Evelyn was her rock, her midwife, her sister. She held Clara's hand, wiped her brow, and whispered words of encouragement, her own past griefs forgotten in the fierce, immediate miracle of the moment. Jack was not allowed in the room. He paced the porch like a caged animal, his hands clenched, his heart a wild drum against his ribs. He listened to Clara's cries, to Evelyn's calm, steady voice, and he felt a helplessness more profound than any he had ever known. He was a builder, a fighter, a tracker, but here, in the face of this sacred, female mystery. He was only a man, waiting. Finally, as the storm passed and the first clean light of dawn broke over the horizon, a new sound joined the gentle dripping of rain from the eaves, the thin, furious cry of a newborn baby. A few minutes later, an exhausted but radiant Evelyn opened the door. She took both of Jack's trembling hands in hers and placed them on her own heart. "You have a daughter," she whispered. The ending was, in truth, a beginning. Some nights, they would sit together on the porch of the house they had built, the house they had saved. Jack in his rocker, a sleeping baby in his arms, with Evelyn on one side, her head resting on his shoulder, and Clara on the other, her hand resting on his knee. They would watch the sunset, painting the vast, empty sky in shades of brilliant, fiery red. They looked out at a world that had once tried to destroy them, a world whose rules they had broken and rewritten. Here, on their small patch of earth, they had found something more than survival. They had found a freedom so profound, a love so expansive, that it could not be contained by fences, or churches, or the judgments of small-minded men. It was as boundless and as beautiful as the wild, western sky itself. Thank you for listening to this story. I wonder where in the world you're tuning in from. Please let me know in the comments below. It would be wonderful to connect with you. If you enjoyed our journey, consider subscribing to the From Wild West channel. And please, share your thoughts.